Welcome to this new 2024 edition of our series on acting in times of crisis. I am Saadi Lahlou, the director of the Paris Institute for Advanced Study. This is the 5th year of this cycle, and unfortunately, the theme is as relevant as in previous years, and I feel it will remain so for some time to come. We're all sadly aware of the high-intensity conflicts and war around the globe, which only add to the many existing low-intensity conflicts. We all want these conflicts to end. But how? And how do conflicts end? This is the theme of this year's cycle. We know how conflicts begin and develop. Aggression and retaliation create an endless spiral in which each side suffers more and more. Those who wage war exploit the human impulse of us against them, turning grief, fear, and frustration into hatred and exacerbating conflict. The media and other industry also feed and exploit times of war. We know that in the future, global tensions and inequalities increase the incidence and persistence of conflict. So the question of how to end conflicts is crucial and urgent. What can the social sciences contribute to the study of the conditions under which conflicts are resolved? Well, this year's Acting in Times of Crisis cycle will focus on this question of how conflicts end. It aims to examine what history has taught us, from peace treaties to reconciliation initiatives. And before we give the floor to our guest today, let me make a brief introduction about conflict. I said we know how conflicts begin and develop. The conflict and violence often begin and develop with a spiral of stress, aggression, and retaliation, which I could call the tragic spiral. Stress leads to blaming an enemy, then to aggression, then to violence, which leads to destruction, then to more stress, retaliation. And this feeds a tragic spiral in which we fight them and they fight us, each party persuaded to respond to the aggression of the other. And this tragic spiral is fed by universal propensities in human nature, many of which we actually share with other social animals and derive from our evolutionary past. We have the fundamental, well, when we have stress, we want to act. We feel strong emotional need to act to stop the stress. And we have 3 ways of doing this: fleeing, which doesn't solve the problem, but makes it safe; acting on the source of stress to solve it; or directing our aggression against ourselves, as in psychosomatic illness. But if we want to fight the cause, that is where the fundamental attribution bias comes in. Humans tend to attribute the cause of things to other persons rather than to the situation. And this immediately brings accusation to some other, right? And with a mechanism of scapegoating and also dehumanization of the other, that brings aggression, which enables us to act out and to get rid of the tension. But this violence also brings in destruction, increases the us versus them phenomenon. And this destruction produces stress, which again brings retaliation, more stress, accusation, aggression, etc. Right? And so we're interested here in what could be the possible ways of getting out, breaking this circle that creates this spiral. So this could be having a rational approach instead of accusation, and analysis of the problem and fighting the problem in cooperation, leveraging pro-sociality and resolving the problem. That should be the logical approach, but it's very often not what happens. And perhaps there's other ways of solving these things and breaking the conflicts. One, it's already started with a lot of damage, which is, repair and reconciliation to stop the thing starting again. I don't know, I am no expert on this question, but tonight we have 3 experts who are also not only academics, but practitioners who have been involved in serious conflicts and their resolution around the world successfully, whom my dear friend and colleague, Séverine Mathieu, who is directrice d'études at École Pratique des Hautes Études, will now introduce.
Thank you, Saadi, and thank you to Enrique, Adam, and Lina to join us today and to introduce that new cycle. And so let me introduce them with some few words. So Lina RESTREPO, you're a full professor of behavioral economics at the Universidad del Valle in Colombia. And there you're directing the Center for Research and Documentation in Socioeconomics. You are a PhD in behavioral economics from University of East Anglia in United Kingdom. And you had led the behavioral studies in Colombia on the financial exclusion of minorities, the exclusion of vulnerable groups from justice, sexual harassment, and labor informality, and the design of inclusive programs aimed at vulnerable population. Your work has been published in Constitutional Political Economy, War Development, and the Journal of Economic and Organization. And then Adam Kahane, you're the director of Reos Partner, which is an international social impact company that helps people move forward together on their most important and intractable issues. And you were named in 2022 a Social Innovator of the Year by the Schwab Foundation. So Adam, you're one of the most prestigious mediators and facilitators for peace. And you've been involved in the South African transition away from apartheid. And you have been working in numerous countries with government, guerrillas, social organizations, and political parties. And in the early 1990s, you were the director of social, political, economics, and technological scenarios for Royal Dutch Shell in London. And Enrique Fatas, you're full professor of economics at the European University in Spain, and there you're directing the Behavioral Economic Institutes. You're also a senior research fellow at the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics and the Penn Development Research Initiative at the University of Pennsylvania in the United States, the Center for Decision Research and Experimental Economics at Nottingham University in the UK, and the Center for Social and Behavior Change at Ascot University in India, among some other institutions. I just quote through. And you've been publishing a lot, more than 75 scientific papers in several journals. And you also work as a senior consultant for international organization and government, including the World Bank and the UN and the European Commission. And you did like the design, implementation, and evaluation of public policies inspired by behavioral science. So the three of you, we thank you very much to participate to that session. And now I will let Paulius ask you the first question. Thank you.
Wonderful. Yes, so I'm Paulius, the scientific director at the Institute for Advanced Study. And I guess we can start with Adam. And the first question is about this cycle that Saadi was describing. Of course, it paints a grim picture. So we were wondering if there's a more positive way in which all of this can play out.
Thank you, Paulius. Yes, studies, a picture is a positive feedback loop, like a snowball going downhill, as we'd say in Canada, where worse leads to worse. The same dynamic can go in the other direction, where better leads to better. But both are present in our world. My work has always been with groups of people who don't necessarily agree with or like or trust each other, but who have already concluded that they need to work together to address the issues that are of concern to them. whether that's conflicts such as South Africa and Colombia or Thailand, or whether it is complex issues such as climate change. So yes, I think it's possible for this cycle to be reversed. I've seen it with my own eyes, and I think that the key to reversing it is contained in the word Saadi used in his slide of dehumanization. So the opposite would be humanization, which is to choose to see others not as non-humans or as objects, but in other ways. And I would point to 3 other ways, all of them useful: to see other people as fellow actors in a problem. You could call that a technocratic perspective. You could see them as parties with interests. You could call that a political orientation. And you can see them as relatives or kin. You could call that a relational orientation. So I think that's the key. The key to running the same cycle in the other direction is in how we choose to engage with others in the system.
Thank you. Maybe we can go on with you, Enrique, and asking you, how do you see differences between people in your survey, in your work?
Thank you for this question, and thank you for the invitation to be here tonight. Well, I believe it is important to acknowledge that conflicts can be very different. And I believe this is a necessity to understand what is needed to do to facilitate reconciliation and move from the vicious circle described by Saadi to the virtuous circle described or outlined by Adam. And I believe from my experience, as you asked, Severin, I would say that it is important to learn the lessons from specific conflict cases. And I believe one of my most positive experiences is how exposure to violent conflict changed for good, tragically, yes, because being exposed to violence is always a tragedy, but for good, the attitudes and behavior of victims in Colombia. I believe Colombia is an archetypical example because of the very long irregular war and the many sufferings the vast majority of Colombians got out of this irregular war. But one of the lessons we learned there is that this tension between us and them in places like Colombia is mediated by what we call the inclusive victimhood. There is no identification, there is no confrontational way of thinking about the others as non-humans, as enemies. And actually, if we can learn a lesson from the Colombian experience, is that victims of a conflict are more willing to concede than non-victims. They are more willing to include the others, for instance, favoring policies targeting the reintegration of ex-combatants. And I believe this is an interesting behavioral lesson, how exposure to violence may actually trigger more rather than less prosociality. And because of that, I believe this is to me, this is one of the ways of thinking about hope in the tragedy of a conflict. But the same experience of a conflict may, in some circumstances, and hopefully we will be able to talk about some recommendations. It does not always happen, but it may facilitate the success of certain reconciliation policies.
Thank you. Great. It seems that a common topic that we are discussing a little bit that seems important is how different actors see each other, how different people see each other as human, non-human, and so on. So Lina, I would like to ask you how you have seen this in your research and what's the importance.
Yes, thank you, Paulus, and thank you for the invitation as well. Basically, what I have to say is more regarding how victims and non-victims see each other and how they see what we call the out-group, which is basically the combatants, people that have been directly in conflict, you know. What we've done we have done and participated in some studies in Colombia. And what we noticed is that, as Enrique just mentioned, because Enrique is also my co-author in several of those papers, is that victims and non-victims, they share kind of, you know, similar backgrounds, similar economic situation. And because victims are already trying to get back on their feet, they are already receiving some help from the government. Because I'm talking about victims that participated in our studies, were already recognized by the state, you know, by the Colombian state. However, what we noticed is that victims are more inclusive with non-victims, more willing to cooperate with non-victims, while those that haven't been affected by conflict directly, let's call them non-victims, are more reluctant and not very willing to work together. And regarding the ex-combatants that have signed, you know, the peace accord, what we notice is that they are all aware that that group is, you know, the out group. They are the people that have been directly you know, producing some damage on them. However, we notice that victims tend to be more resilient and willing to help and willing to contribute and willing to participate in different cooperative actions than people that have not been affected by conflict. In summary, what we notice is that exposure to conflict affects the way we see each other, because it seems to me that you know, from the evidence, is that those who have been victimized tend to be more to be prone, you know, to get agreements and to see others like themselves as peers and willing to help and willing to do something to restore the social fabric.
I would like to ask you if, in your experience, if you could give us an example of how the victim and non-victim deal, and how do people are willing to overcome with their feelings? If you could give us some example from your experience in the field.
Yes. I also have experience in Colombia, which I think is relevant here. And for me, the starting point or the key fork in the road is, do I believe that I can prevail unilaterally? Do I believe that I can win? And of course, one feature of the Colombian situation, right up until the final years of the negotiations, was that both sides, certainly the government, believed it could prevail and attempted to do so. So for me, the pragmatic element is the idea that a recognition, whether it's the Colombian case or the global climate case, that even though we might prefer to have it the way we want it to be, we have already understood that we can't do that. That our future depends on others and requires collaboration. So that for me is fundamental. But I have also been interested, as Lina was, in this in the role of the victims, because I have also noticed, for example, in the 9 days of workshops in the Destino Colombia project, which brought together all of the actors, including politicians, military, business, FARC, ELN, self-defense forces, in a very intensive process. I also noticed that those who had suffered most directly were the most determined to find a peaceful solution, not to end the conflict, but to transform the conflict from violent to non-violent. And I think you could say that it is a pragmatism. You could also say it is a recognition of the fellow suffering. That, as Carl Rogers said, what is most personal is most universal. And to realize that you have also suffered, maybe from the actions of my side, and therefore I see you as human rather than as non-human. So I think this question of what is it that motivates people to collaborate even with the enemy has these multiple dimensions.
Thank you. Lina, would you like to comment on that? What do you think? Yes, those differences between victims and not victims, and cooperation. Yeah, how do they play out?
Yeah, it is really interesting, because what we noticed is that, victims and not victims, they know who the foe is, well, let's not call him the foe, who is the outgroup. But and they both hold similar expectations and beliefs and norms, and they know they will, if possible, they wouldn't engage in working with ex-combatants, because they have been affected, they have been victimized by them. In the case of victims and non-victims, they hold their own beliefs, and they know, no, these guys have been doing damage to the country and to all their fellow Colombians, and they hold the same beliefs, they hold norms against the ex-combatants. However, what we found is something beautiful, which is that victims are willing to overcome their beliefs and their norms in order to cooperate with the ex-combatants that are interested, into getting in a peaceful solution. It's something that Adam kind of mentioned, which is, well, probably they are not looking for ending the conflict, because we can live with conflict, but we cannot live with violent conflict. So it is all about finding a peaceful solution. And I think in what our studies showed is that victims are more willing to do so. Also, something that is quite interesting that we found in a different study is called the NIMBY effect, which is not in my backyard effect, meaning that what we saw that we call people, to cooperate and to help entrepreneurs that are victims and entrepreneurs that are ex-combatants. And we kind of ran a fundraising campaign. And we asked people, hey, will you be able, will you be happy to donate some money for this campaign? And to some people, we asked to donate for the victims activities, and to other people, we asked for the ex-combatants activities. And we find no difference. We find no differences between the money that people were willing to donate towards ex-combatants or victims. But what we found is a massive difference in the way they perceived these two groups. So basically, even though there are not many behavioral differences, there are still attitudes. There are still attitudes that are playing along. So the fear, their anxiety, is still playing a massive role on how people feel about the other person. But even lay people that have not been directly affected by conflict, they are also willing to overcome that anxiety, that fear, and say, well, no, let's do this together. There is not any other way we can do it.
Great, thank you. I will continue then, and then Zeppelin will do the last. Thank you so much, Lina. Now I would like to ask Enrique a little bit about this interesting idea that we've listened about victims being more willing to cooperate, to concede, and so on. Do you have some explanation of why this might happen?
Certainly, this is very interesting and intriguing. Some may think of it or may see it as counterintuitive. But I mean, one of the regularities we have documented, I mean, not only the three of us, but many other scholars, about what are the consequences on human behavior of exposure to violent conflict. I mean, in some directions, I mean, risk preferences, time preferences, making victims more risk-loving, more impatient. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to focus on prosociality. And one well-established regularity in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Europe is that violent conflict exposure makes victims more prosocial with members of their in-group. And, I mean, other victims like them. And they also increase their prosociality with members of other vulnerable groups they perceive to be similar to them, okay? Now, this is an interesting regularity. Why? Because it tells us an interesting story about how to promote reconciliation. If we are able to stop or mitigate the dehumanization of the others, the them versus us, it is more likely that victims will also understand the suffering of the other part. And the other part could be the other group, or could be also combatants or ex-combatants, as we were discussing. If I see them as members of another vulnerable group, well, this boost in my prosociality may apply not only to victims like me, members of my same group, but also to people at the other side of the conflict, the other group, even ex-combatants. So the behavioral logic here is also connected with how we experience losses. A very well-established behavioral regularity is that we humans, and this is based in prospect theory, that we humans perceive losses as larger than equivalent gains. So victims suffered a lot. And because they do not want to take any chance of this suffering being repeated, and being perpetuated, they are more open because they know better. They are more open to concede, particularly if they see the other side as equal to them. They do not dehumanize them. They are more able and more willing to concede and open a road for the political inclusion of the other group. It is not that conflict disappears or vanishes. It is that the violence embedded in conflict goes away, and then we try to solve conflict and to reach a solution pacifically by political means. This is what the inclusion of the other means in terms of victims of conflict.
Thank you very much, Enrique. And we're almost about the end of the session. And before we have an exchange between the three of you, I would have a question, and that question will be for the three of you, but maybe start by Lina. Would you have some recommendation, in order to see how we can make the conflict end? Lina, maybe you first.
Yeah, thank you. Well, unfortunately, I will be able more, to focus more on how can we make peace prevail. And so I would say that Enrique just mentioned something that is quite interesting, that is losses affect a lot how people behave, and because we experience so much this utility, so much this utility when we lose something. The experiences is way stronger than when we experience a gain, when we win something. So if victims has lost so much, probably that is explaining why they are more willing to concede, more willing to engage in peace processes. Probably we need to also do the same with society. People that have not been affected by conflict, they probably need to know what is there to lose if they do not engage in a peaceful solution of things. Also, I would suggest that we are by nature quite prosocial. If we might incorporate the victim's view in the way that people that have not been affected by conflict see the situation, so they can feel more empathetic regarding a peaceful solution of conflict. And the other way, the other thing I really believe it is important to take care of, is that we need to make sure that the underlying reasons that ignited conflict in first place are resolved. Because we need to make sure that there are not underlying, inequalities, that people feel that they can trust in the government that is suggesting a peaceful solution. So that is to make sure that we do not go back to the same problem again. And I would like to say something else. Another thing that has worked out really good is the contact hypothesis. When you get in contact and you get to know what the other person is, how that person also has a family, used to be a peasant, for instance, or used to be a business person or whatever. So that also humanized again the person who used to be dehumanized because of conflict reasons.
Thank you, Lina. Adam, would you have some recommendation?
Yes, I do, but I'd like to switch the example and the emphasis from these situations of armed conflict. And what I worry is putting the responsibility on the victims to another difficult situation that my colleagues and I have been working on a lot, which is global climate matters. And the recommendation or the approach which we've been working with is to promote what we call radical collaboration. That climate cannot be addressed unilaterally. Not only can it not be mitigated unilaterally, it cannot. It's becoming increasingly clear that everybody is going to be a victim. But questions of justice are very important in this issue, both with regard to historical responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions and with respect to the resources to adapt to a dangerously changing climate. So the question is, given this need to respond with speed and scale and speed and scale and justice, how can we collaborate effectively? And I come back to the same three dimensions that I referred to earlier. There is a technocratic dimension where this is a problem to be solved, in which many actors need to participate. At the same time, it is a negotiation. And that's what the Conference of the Parties is it's a negotiation among parties, in this case, parties to a treaty, as well as non-governmental parties. And fundamentally, it is also a relational challenge in how we can cohabit on this planet. So this is the kind of engagement that is required not only in situations of war, although there are also violent conflicts associated or increasingly associated with climate change, but also in other sort of common problematic situations.
Thank you to enlarge the topic. And now, Enrique, do you have some recommendation?
So, briefly, and I am very happy to hear Adam mentioning climate change. You said it cannot be addressed unilaterally. I would say it cannot be addressed locally. That is something slightly different. We may have an opportunity to talk about that. So recommendations. Well, I would love to have a magic ballot, but I don't, as you, of course, may anticipate. So I would make two recommendations. Recommendation number one, do not use the memory of conflict in a partisan way. This may not only perpetuate conflict itself, it may also come at the price of cognitive skills, as Francesco Bogliacino and Gianluca Grimalda have documented in the case of Colombia. So recalling the traumatic experience of conflict may actually harm victims even 20 years later, for instance, job market prospects. And the second recommendation is about communication. I mean, communicate well in reconciliation policy, recognizing the suffering of the other. That is also part of any successful initiative, preventing the dehumanization of the other side. And also preventing something we have documented in Colombia, that is the discrimination toward victims and ex-combatants benefiting from specific policies. A good communication policy, making very explicit the suffering of the other group, is essential to legitimate these reconciliation policies, making the success of a peace process or the chances or the prospects of a reconciliation process better.
Or if I may try to
Maybe Saadi,
summarize what I what I understood. So there's the first thing is in any case, if we have managed to limit the conflict to avoid it starting again, we should avoid reactivating the us versus them or instrumenting this in any kind of way, because we try to put people together instead of against each other, right? And then I hear two directions. The first one is fighting together or collaborating together against a big common loss, okay? And this is very similar to the Robbers Cave experiments by Sheriff and Sheriff, the conclusions that the only way to reconcile two parties who were opposing is to make them do something together to avoid a common problem or to fight against a third party, but that's the same perspective. And the other way I hear, which is a bit position exchange, like we know from the black car map task that if you take the position of the other, you're less prone to conflict when there's a misunderstanding. So in a way, facilitating empathy and sympathy with the other by making them feel what they feel as human beings is another way of doing things positively, at least to open the discussion. And the other fascinating thing that I hear here is you say, we cannot end the conflict, but we can end the violence and go to more civilized way of solving it. So is that what I hear, or perhaps you want to comment and correct my understanding. Adam? And then you guys should talk because you are the experts.
Yeah, for me, the framing this as ending the conflict, I think, is unrealistic and counterproductive. There are many differences and disagreements, and in some of them were not visible because they were suppressed. And so I think some of what we're seeing in the world is a greater voice and a greater ability to organize and greater ability to find allies. So I think the prospect of ending conflict is nil, and I think the labeling conflict as a problem is counterproductive because it doesn't make it disappear, it just makes it go underground. So what I'm more interested in is what are constructive and peaceful, or let me say non-violent ways of dealing with genuine differences. And yes, I didn't know the specific literature you're referring to, but all of my work of the past 30 years has been when there is a shared task, a shared challenge, a group challenge or a societal challenge, if it is organized effectively, then the pro-social tendencies that you have been alluding to can be engaged. And I think this is the opportunity presented by, yes, the non-local, non-unilateral challenge of climate change, where in fact a great progress is being made in a very difficult and awkward way through the UNFCCC processes and otherwise. The difficulty is the time dimension. That's what makes climate and similar issues so difficult. Is it's not good enough to say we'll get there eventually. There's a ticking clock. So that's why the challenge is not simply a collaboration, but collaboration with the requisite speed and scale and justice. And that is where the body of work that we're labeling radical collaboration is important.
Well, yes, this is a fascinating point. I believe time is of utmost importance regarding climate change and the solution of this conflict. In a sense, it is also a very good example of, or a very good answer to Saadi's question about, conflict without violence. Well, yes, I mean, conflict is human. I mean, you can think of politics as a way of solving pacifically through institutions, of course. The divergences and the radical differences in terms of distribution of resources, outcomes in society, rights, whatever. What I believe makes climate change so unique is not only this global dimension, the idea that we cannot solve or get out of this trap individually or as a nation or a group. It is also the time dimension, the timeline. We don't have much future. We don't have much time to act. We need to act immediately. But we have a long past, a long history of who did what and which country benefited more from emissions. And this adds a layer of complexity to any negotiation and any process to solve and find solutions regarding climate change, particularly when actors are very different. Actors are very different. Today, think of France. Just go and tell the farmers blocking the highways in France, talk to them about climate change and how they need to adapt. Or, for instance, some of my work with Lina on how Colombian farmers are receiving, processing information to adapt their strategies regarding cropping and different seeds with climate change, the ambiguity of climate change. They are very different actors, even when they are also farmers. Then think of industries, think of governments. I believe the challenge there is colossal. At the same time, it is a very good example of conflict without violence.
Yes, thank you. Well, the time variable is quite interesting. And we need to be very careful in the way we communicate, as Enrique mentioned previously. We should communicate policies supporting victims and ex-combatants in a way that do not create any animosity into society. We should be more careful on and use, for instance, the losses frame and let people know what they can lose if they do not engage in peaceful solutions, what they can lose if do not engage in more in environmental friendly activities, you know. However, and also something that I read recently is that from different paper is that the more we talk about these things, the more they become normalized. So, for instance, if we talk a lot about conflict, if we talk a lot about climate change, people get used to it. So, in the case in the conflict scenario, that it might become that people get dehumanized the situation. Oh, okay, this is again Gaza people, poor people. And it becomes a number, a really sad number, but it becomes a number. People get used to it. So to what extent, probably the communication, the way we are once and again talking about these things, it's important. We cannot shut up about it, you know? But how do we do it so that we do not create a normalization of the problem in people? I don't know if you know something about this, Adam or Enrique. How can we do so that people do not get used to the problem, to the conflict, violent conflict. So they do not get used to the weather becoming warmer and warmer, you know.
Well, if I may jump in, sorry, I always talk too much. This reminds me of something that, I mean, there is something bridging this. I believe communication is, of course, essential, and it applies to violent conflict and it applies to climate change, just to make people aware, raising awareness of the necessity of reaching agreements and taking actions. I mean, the lack of good communication may actually trigger what we call in behavioral sciences a stigma reversal. Well, there are some policies in place benefiting certain groups, and if this policy is not well communicated, what this may trigger is a negative reaction regarding reconciliation policies in conflict or post-conflict scenarios, or regarding actions promoting or dealing with climate change. Well, this is designed to benefit others, not myself. Why should I support something if badly communicated that is not benefiting me? And I say badly communicated because at the end of the day, with climate change, it is an excellent example of a conflict in which we are all on board together. It is impossible to say that I am not affected by climate change as a resident in this planet. So preventing this stigma reversal by proper and effective communication policies is crucial to make people, actors, understand the benefits waiting for all of us if one policy is correctly and successfully implemented. And I see the parallelism between both scenarios.
But you know, if this was enough, we would already have started really doing something about climate change, but it doesn't really happen. So one thing that perhaps we could act on is that, I mean, humans are intensely, social animals, and there's pro-sociality, right? So if you manage to create a social movement, participation becomes a reward in itself. And so what we have seen in the past is that in front of great catastrophes, when it starts to be a social movement, people act, and the fact that they act keeps them going. The problem we have here is to make them start and then to keep them going, because the humans get used to everything, right? Even, you know, the terrible situation, they get used to them. But what they enjoy is collective action. And so maybe starting collective action, is that something that you have tried, and does it work in these peace processes?
No, I would start in a different place, Saadi. I keep doing this to you, but we don't have to start a social movement on climate change. It's probably the largest and most global social movement in world history, with large numbers of people, including young people, in almost every place in the world. So what I find is important is how can we harness or work with the energies and movements and drives that are already present, whether it's in social movements or social entrepreneurs or neighborhood associations or leaders, political or social or business leaders who think they need to address a certain problem. In English, people very often use the phrase, "How can we get people to?" This is and I find it extremely unhelpful. Mostly because I don't think we can get people to do anything at all. At least my own experience, both in all realms, including my family realm, is I can really have almost no capacity to get people to do anything. So so the alternative for me is, how can we tap into the energies which are already flowing? And climate provides a great example of that, and support it and help it be more effective and impactful.
Perhaps this would be a great sentence for a conclusion, even though if it's interrogative. Unless you have a better one, I think we should close on this. How can we tap into the energies that are already here? Because there is. And so we should not lose hope. And as you said, Adam, some movements have already started. And there is always a movement that is started in all these conflicts, positive movements. And perhaps the way to unite them and encourage them and start them is the way to go. My friends, thank you very much for this discussion. It's a long way we have to go through, but you gave us very important and useful indications based on your vast experience. Thank you again. Séverine, what's next?
So thank you very much. Thank you, Enrique, Fatas. Thank you, Adam Kahane, and thank you, Lina RESTREPO. So we'll pursue the conversation and the discussion next time with session on peace process and resolution of conflicts. So it will be really in the continuity of that session. So thank you very much again. And
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I learned
great
dialogue. It was very, very interesting for me.
I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you very much.